Since Josephus was a turncoat, I mean, he started out as a British general, and then he flips and starts working for the Romans. Does that distort or make untrue or affect the credibility of any of the things we're reading on geography?
Yeah, that's a good question. Josephus was a pretty tricky customer, of course, as the question implies. I mentioned that Josephus was a general in sort of 66, 67 on the Jewish side. He then realized the error of his ways and saw the way the wind was blowing and went over to the Roman side. I think in Josephus's writing, certainly he highlights particular geographical locations for particular reasons. And sometimes he makes exaggerations about the populations of towns that he was in charge of, and is rather sort of mean-minded about the towns that John of Giscala is in charge of. But I don't think he sort of invents place names or anything like that. I don't think any scholars would really think that he sort of invents things out of whole cloth.
All right. While we're on the subject then of Josephus, some astute Road to Emmaus Bible scholar out there wrote, Josephus says Emmaus is 30 stadia from Jerusalem. Luke 24:13 gives it 60 stadia.
Mm-hmm. Well spotted.
Some Alexandrian texts say 160 stadia.
Uh-huh.
What do you make of all of that?
That's a good question. I think the 160 stadia is easy to deal with. The reason for some manuscripts having 160 stadia was that there was a much more famous Emmaus quite a bit further away from Jerusalem, what's known as Emmaus Nicopolis. This was a major city, and so this was a city much better known to scribes, and so some scribes made the unhelpful correction by making Emmaus further away than it actually is. The Emmaus referred to in the Gospels is somewhere where Jesus and the two disciples can get to from Jerusalem and back to Jerusalem in a night. Now, 160 stadia is 20 miles, so you can't really do that very easily in the night. Whereas the 30 or 60 actually for Josephus is not that bad. Sometimes Josephus himself varies quite considerably. And of course, there's a difference between, there are different routes that one could take from Emmaus to Jerusalem. So I think it's not too easy to explain a discrepancy between what was sort of, I guess, about 3.5 miles and 7 miles.
Okay, do you feel the real value in establishing the geographical existence of these places also supports the truth of Jesus' humanity? Places exist in time and space, and God, in his own time, chose to join man, the crown of his creation, as one of us. Therefore, we can say these places exist in history, and so does Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a very helpful point, I think, that we have in the incarnation, Jesus not just becoming a human being, but specifically becoming a Jewish human being, and the revelation of God is not sort of something that just happens to all of us in our hearts, but the revelation of God is supremely revealed in a particular time, in a particular space, in Jesus' incarnation, workings of miracles, teaching, and death and resurrection. Yeah, thank you. That's a helpful point.
Okay, at the end of Mark 4, Jesus is at the lake of Gennesaret.
Mm-hmm.
In Mark 5:1, he's in Gerasa. Did Mark not do the geography of Palestine? Does Matthew correct this city name from Mark?
He's teaching beside the lake at the beginning of Mark 4. And then at the end of Mark 4, he says, let's go over to the other side. And so there's of course the calming of the storm that takes place while they're going over to the other side. But then eventually they get to the other side, to the country of the Gerasenes, to the east part, the eastern shore. Now, when we think of going across to the other side, we've got our nice map. And so we think of going from one side to another as going from the west, say Tiberias, to the east, where Gerasa or Gergesa or Gadara is. So we naturally think of east-west travel to going there with the other side. But I think what we have here is actually going from the north to the east. And for the mental geography of the fishermen, of course, most of the many of the disciples were from the north. To them, going to the area on the east side, around where you can see Gergesa there, is just as much going across to the other side as it would be if you were going from the west side of the shore. So we've got to bear in mind the sort of mental geography of the fisherman who's, and I think it's very much sort of Jesus' outlook as well. Jesus, the outlook of the Gospels is very much a Sea of Galilee outlook from the north. I would argue probably reflecting Peter's own perspective, which is reflected in the Gospel of Mark, his interpreter.
Okay. How do we know New Testament locations were written independently from those other sources? Could the New Testament have just copied those?
I think in the case of the Old Testament, you could make that kind of argument. You could say they're sort of constructing this Old Testament type geography. But I think the parallels with Josephus make it much more difficult, because Josephus is writing at roughly the same time as, or even after, in the case of his later writings, after the Gospels. So the Gospel writers couldn't really have got their geography from Josephus. And in the case of the rabbinic literature, it's even more difficult, because the first wave of rabbinic literature that I mentioned, the Mishnah, comes from AD 200, Tosefta in sort of 300 or 400, the Talmud in 400 or 500. So in the case of Josephus and the rabbis, the literature is much later than the Gospels.
Are none of the manuscripts Lightfoot used available, and is that why we use his work, Lightfoot's work?
Lightfoot mainly relied on printed editions rather than manuscripts, and those printed editions still survive today. They're in the Cambridge University Library, so you can come and look at them. Yeah, Loysden was a scholar who edited the Talmud, for example. Those are the editions that Lightfoot.
Yeah, just so we're clear, Cambridge has borrowed our copies. They are on loan, and you can go see them there. Why do you think none of the Gospels mention the Roman city Sepphoris?
That's a very insightful question. Yeah, Sepphoris is one of the, along with Tiberias, one of the major locations, major big metropolis of Galilee. And it's interesting, in the case of Tiberias as well, we don't have any record of Jesus visiting Tiberias. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned that Tiberias is a place where people come from to see Jesus, and we get the mention of the Sea of Galilee as the Sea of Tiberias. Jesus, as far as we can tell from the Gospels, didn't go there. He may have done, but the Gospels don't record it. So it may have been that Jesus avoided big cities. I don't know. It's not quite the case that he was a sort of rural country bumpkin, because he does visit significant towns as well. But it's a very good question. Yeah.
Okay, a couple of more. We've got a little bit more time. Did Joseph and Jesus ever travel out of the Holy Land?
Joseph and Jesus.
What it said. I'm just reading the question.
Well, Joseph of Arimathea, of course, went to live in the south of France after, as we know from the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And yeah. I had great fun.
If we read the Book of Mormon,
I had great fun watching a TV program with my 11-year-old daughter about how Jesus went to England, of course, where he learned many of his miraculous powers from the Druids there. But I think Jesus visited Tyre and Sidon, which is sort of outside the Holy Land proper.
So are you an advocate? This is a Lanier question. Did Jesus speak Greek?
Oh, he might well have done.
Yeah. Well, yeah, well, okay. But there's a scholastic debate of sorts.
Yeah.
Where do you land on that debate?
Well, I think there's speaking Greek and speaking Greek, isn't there? I mean, there's what you might call, and this might be sort of a rather sort of politically incorrect thing to say. There's sort of taxi driver Greek, isn't there? Where you know enough Greek to get by for your particular purposes. And so Jesus might well have had that kind of working knowledge of Greek, where he could order a meal in a restaurant.
Peter Williams believes Jesus may have done his Beatitudes in Greek.
Yeah, I can see why he might think that. Yeah.
Okay. We need to have Peter and Simon here at the same time to debate the merits of their views. Relating this to Acts, how does the mention of geographical locations and the geographical detail in canonical Acts compare with non-canonical Acts literature, if you've done such a search?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't actually. I haven't compared
That's for next year.
Acts with non-canonical Acts. I think actually the non-canonical Acts probably have more place names than the non-canonical Gospels do, because there's a lot of traveling around in non-canonical
How did you go
Acts.
about your research of the names of cities from the Gospels?
I sort of burrowed around, really. That's what I sort of tend to do, just sort of sniff around in a few manuscripts and printed editions. And yeah,
Is the New Testament Tyre the same as mentioned in Ezekiel 27?
Yes.
We're in the lightning round. Some secular scholars deny the historical accuracy of Josephus. How would you respond to their arguments?
I think when they talk about the historical accuracy of Josephus, I mean, certainly Josephus is not, inerrant, and Josephus often gets things confused and also manipulates information. I go back to what I said about the place names, though. He certainly doesn't invent place names. He might exaggerate the populations, and at one point he says there are 204 towns in Galilee with more than 20,000 inhabitants. That's probably a bit rich, but in the main, he's accurate.
Okay. One quick atonement question, and then I've got a couple here that I haven't had time to ask, and I apologize to the people who wrote them out, but I'm running out of time, and I want to ask one atonement question. This is like a softball. Please explain Isaiah 53.
Oh, wow.
And I will tell everyone that it's painted in that vignette that on the arch closest to me, down above the window there. The double-framed vignette is an Isaiah 53 painting. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I'll say two things. First of all, Isaiah 53 in itself is a kind of literary...
Isaiah.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I used to have a little teddy bear, actually, that had a wonky face, and I called him Isaiah because one eye was higher than the other. But I digress. Isaiah 53 as a literary narrative is just great. And one of the best descriptions of it, I mentioned this in the panel on Friday, so apologies if you were there and are hearing this for the second time. One German scholar has described it as a drama of delayed recognition. The figure in Isaiah 53 is killed and persecuted as someone who was thought to be cursed by God. But then later, the people in the narration realize their mistake, realize their error, and realize that actually the one that we thought was cursed and punished by God was actually our liberator. He was bruised for our transgressions. And not only was this death something which was unjust, but in some mysterious way led to the redemption of the people as well. And I think that alternation, secondly, the alternation that you have in Isaiah 53 between the he and us. He was bruised for our iniquities. He bore our iniquities. Is something that we find coming into the New Testament as the one place, really, in the Old Testament where one person dies on behalf of another. Most of the time in the Old Testament, you're not allowed to have one person die for another, but this is the sort of this is the great miraculous exception, and that's what Paul sets out to show in 1 Corinthians 15 when he talks about Christ dying. He died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. That's the miracle of the gospel, that the cycle of people just dying over and over again for their own sins is broken through the action of Christ. So Isaiah 53 is a fascinating sort of literary product in its own right, but even more significant as the source of the gospel.
Okay, would you all join me in thanking Simon?